Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is beavers, friend, not foe, and it'll be presented by our fabulous expedition leader, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here today. I know you've got a lot to share, so let's go ahead and get started.
Thanks so much, Sunny, and thanks everybody for joining me today, wherever you are in the world and whatever wonderful spring day you might be having where you are right now. So today, as Sunny let us know here, we're going to be talking about beavers. And first, a little bit about me. Like Sunny said, my name's Eleanor. I'm one of the Canadian expedition leaders with Natural Habitat Adventures. And I guide mainly on our Churchill trips, including the upcoming beluga whale season, as well as the other Churchill itineraries like polar bears and northern lights. And I also guide more in the east of Canada in Quebec with our Quebec itineraries. I wanted to talk about beavers today because they're very interesting. They're a very, very widespread North American species. And I think for a lot of us, as beavers are coming more and more into areas that we live in and work in and play in, we're starting to encounter them maybe more than we ever had before. And that goes for me as well. I see way more beavers now than I did when I was a kid, and more beavers now than I did 20 years ago. So they are a species on the rise. They're really interesting, and they have a large part to play in North American history, but especially Canadian history. So it's something that's very close to me as a Canadian. So today we'll be talking about some of the biology of the beaver species, what led them to be such an important part of that North American history, and really one of the things that brought a lot of Europeans here in their role as a fur-bearing mammal, and then getting into kind of what's happening these days with beavers in terms of conservation efforts and how we're starting to really recognize their importance as an ecosystem engineer. And I'll just mention before I start off that where I am here today, a very, very windy day. And that sometimes means for me that I get little internet blips. If I disappear, I promise I will be right back when the wind stops blowing for half a second. So I won't be gone for long if you get any blips happening with me. But let's start talking about beavers. Beavers they're big and they're rodents and they are widespread in North America. So there's actually two species of beaver currently living. They're both in the genus Castor. There's Castor canadensis, which is the North American beaver, and it's native to kind of the temperate areas of North America. So all the way up from Alaska down through every province, pretty well every province and territory in Canada, and then through the US and into northern Mexico as well. This here is a beautiful example of a North American beaver. They are the second largest rodent currently living on the planet after the capybara. This one that you can see here is the Eurasian beaver. So like the North American beaver, it's in the genus Castor, but the species name for this one is Castor fiber. So this is a species that was once widespread in Eurasia, was hunted to near extinction, and has rebounded in the last century and a half or so. It looks a little bit different than the North American beaver. It's got a longer head. The openings to the nasal cavities are kind of triangular. Their fur color is a little bit lighter. You can see here, this one's more blonde than our North American brownish beaver, and the tail on the Eurasian beaver is narrower. But the biggest difference is one that you can't see, and it's the thing that really has separated them into separate species, and they actually have different numbers of chromosomes. They are not able to interbreed at all. Back before we had the ability to use microscopy and count chromosome numbers, the Eurasian beaver and the North American beaver were thought to likely be different subspecies of the same species. So they were usually considered as just slightly different looking beavers, but they were all the same. We now know that they are They are separate species, and then within the North American beaver and the Eurasian beaver, we can look at different subspecies in there too. But in general, we'll mostly today be talking about the North American beaver, but we'll loop back and talk about the Eurasian beaver as well, because they're very similar ecologically in what they do for the landscape. Beavers they're a relatively recent addition to our landscape. Beavers got their start back in the Miocene around 24 million years ago, when we have this lovely guy on the left here, the giant beaver, which was a newly evolved species at that point. Like a lot of mammals back in the Pleistocene and the Miocene, they were big. Big mammals were the way that a lot of organisms went due to the cooling temperatures. It allowed them to retain heat better. And we know from looking at dentition on the giant beaver that they were the first of what we would call the true castorids, like beaver-like organisms that were semi-aquatic and that fed on bark primarily and woody materials. They were about the size of an adult human. They were very, very big beavers. Today we have the beavers like on the right there. North American beaver and Eurasian beaver are both roughly about the same size. They're about a meter long, around 3 feet or so, and they weigh up to around 30 kilograms or around about 60 or 70 pounds. We know that in North America, let me back up. We know that the beaver, the castor genus, originated in Eurasia. So the first true beavers were found in Europe and Asia, starting around 12 million years ago. And then we're pretty sure that they got to North America around 8 million years ago by crossing the Bering Land Bridge, when sea levels were lower and animals were able to cross between northern Asia and into Alaska, and then down the coast into other areas of North America. So that's how long they've been here. Relatively new, but 8 million years is still a good chunk of time for an animal. So as mentioned, they are the second largest living rodents. We'll count both beaver species there together. Males and females are basically identical. You can't sex them by just looking at them in the water or on the ground. They're quite streamlined, and they're really adapted for that semi-aquatic lifestyle that they have, along with their lifestyle of what they need to eat. So their dentition, the type of teeth that they have, is quite well adapted for the feeding mechanisms that they use. If you look on the right-hand side there, that is a beaver pelt that somebody is spreading open, so you can see both types of hair that are present on a beaver. Beavers are quite densely furred, up to a density of around 148,000 hairs per square inch, or if you want the metric, around 23,000 hairs per square centimeter. This hair is essential both for keeping the animal warm. It also helps it float in water because that dense hair can trap air as they enter the water. And it also is a means of protecting it against their predators, because while beavers are big and they can be fierce, they have been known to attack people and dogs and other animals. Primarily, they're right, they're a herbivore. They don't eat meat. They are predated upon by multiple species, including fishers, coyotes, hawks, bears, lynx, eagles, mountain lions, wolves, and their kits may be predated upon by owls as well. So the hairs that are on there come in two types. There's the guard hairs, which are the long outer hairs, come to about 2 to 3 inches long. And the color of that can vary depending on which species we're talking about and which individual we're looking at. And that under fur, it's really worth feeling if you ever get a chance to feel a beaver pelt. The under fur is quite soft, much shorter, about tops at around 1 inch long, and it is darker in color. And like I said, much softer. They do molt once a year during the summer when they're less likely to need that much insulation, and so they will replace that hair once a year. We know beavers primarily by what they do. And beavers have these incredibly huge incisors that are able to chew right through bark and right through wood and can fell quite large trees. Some of the images I took for this webinar here, I went for a walk yesterday down to my creek where I have some very, very active beaver habitats. And the trees that you can see here on the ground are all trees that were taken by one family of beavers just this spring. So since the ice has been off the water, which is where I am, only about 3 weeks or so, if you can believe that. So they have been felling trees like nobody's business. Your average beaver, one beaver, fells 216 trees per year. They can do it quite quickly. So a smaller tree around, 6 or 7 inches wide, they can take down in under an hour. A bigger tree might take half a day. There's a very distinctive pattern, and if you've ever seen a beaver, working at a tree, or you've walked through a forest where beavers have been active, you'll recognize this. You see this on a tree, and you say to yourself, huh, must be beavers around, because there's nothing else that's going to create that very distinctive pattern like that. So they take big chunks out of the tree. You can see the woody chips left on the ground as they work at it. And that angle that they cut at is always exactly the same, because it's just determined by the angle of the hinge on their jaws. So that shape is absolutely a beaver. Nothing else will be doing that. As we mentioned, they are, of course, semi-aquatic. We see them mostly in the water. Their nostrils, their ears have valves that are able to close underwater, and they have nictitating membranes that cover the eyes. One of the cool things that beavers can do is they can actually close their lips behind their incisors. So they're able to chew on bark and wood while they are in the water without getting water in their mouth. So they're actually fully able to close off both their larynx and their trachea with their tongue, in addition to being able to close their lips behind their teeth. We find beavers only in freshwater ecosystems. They're not found in brackish water or salt water, mostly in things like wetlands, like lakes and ponds and rivers and streams. If you don't have water, you're not going to have beavers. They absolutely require water, and that water needs to be year-round. So if it's a water supply that goes dry every summer, that would not be considered beaver habitat either. They like slow-moving streams. You generally won't find them in like a mountain stream. They like it when it's around, 1 or 2% grade, and they won't go higher than 15%. And most beavers will not go up to a 15% grade anyway. They actually don't like it when it floods. If there's a major flooding event in a beaver habitat, it might be abandoned by beavers for a few years to come. And when remote sensors or ecologists or biologists are looking at what areas are potential beaver habitat, it's actually very easy for them to figure it out, because beavers have very, very precise habitat needs. They need that year-round water. So it needs to be either running water or a pond or a lake. They need enough of a slope that they can dig into the side of that slope. They need access to a wood source or a forest within 150 feet of that water. You have those things, you are likely either already have beavers, or you will have beavers in the future when they move into your area. While they are semi-aquatic, it's not like they're whales. They're not able to hold their breath for an hour or two at a time. They can only hold their breath for about 15 minutes, and most of the time, not longer than 30 seconds to a minute. So they're just doing very shallow, short dives, because they're living in a fairly small, shallow, pond or lake environment. They have quite dexterous feet, so they're able to pick things up and carry them around. And they have what we know of as very typical of that beaver, that very large, flat tail. That tail is, right, it feels like it might just be used as a rudder, but it has some other features as well. It's used to slap the water. It can be a warning sign, as I was getting some tail slaps happening yesterday when I was taking photos, telling me to go away. Thank you very much. It's also, though, used for stability. So when beavers go up on their back legs to either grab wood and carry it around, or to stand further up so they can gnaw further up on a tree, that tail actually provides a third point of contact with the ground and just extra stability for as they move around. The reason that they need wood within 150 feet or so of their water habitat is that beavers need to build dams. We know beavers build dams, it's what they are known for, because that dam creates their habitat. They find streams and they use streams, but they don't actually want to live in a stream. They want to create a dam, slow that water down, and create that very slow-moving still pond for their habitat. And we know that the sound of running water actually stimulates beavers to build dams. They hear water, they go right into dam building mode or into repair mode for the dam that they already have. So it's pretty cool. If you have a lake dwelling beaver, they get to skip this stage because they've already got that steady shallow pond that they can work in. We also know that beavers build lodges. So this is a diagram of what the inside of a beaver lodge looks like. This is one of the places that they live during the year. And it's usually not just one beaver that lives in here, because you have beaver families that all live together. Your basic unit of social organization is not a beaver or a pair of beavers, it is a family of beavers, which is an adult male and an adult female. They work in a monogamous pair, and they have within their lodge their offspring, usually this year's litter as well as last year's litter. And once their offspring is 2 years old, they will generally go off and build their own lodge and find their own mates, which is usually done fairly close to where their parents are. If you've been in an area that has beavers, you've probably seen this kind of lodge before. So it has the underwater entrance, and then above the water is a very protected area where they can rest and they can feed, and this is where they give birth to their young as well. However, it's not the only kind of lodge that beavers make. This is called an open water lodge. Another type of lodge is called a bank lodge, which is where they build a series of tunnels and holes in the sloping bank beside where their water habitat is. Generally speaking, we get both types of those habitats present at a single site. And this next photo here, this is not a picture of a beaver. Obviously, this is one of my dogs who came with me on a walk to take pictures yesterday, and he is showing you the scale of what a bank lodge can look like. So those holes in the ground to the right side of the dog there are some of the access points for a bank lodge for the family of beavers that lives there. Because the water was higher in the spring floods, those areas were covered up. Now that the water has receded, it's very likely that that family of beavers will come in and cover that area up with things like reeds and branches and sticks, so that it's not as obvious that there is a lodge underneath the ground there. So pretty neat. If you've never looked around, you might not have noticed it. It's sometimes hard to pick up on. And of course, this is what a pond lodge or an open water lodge can look like. Just to the middle right of this photo, we have a beaver-formed wetland with a lodge in the middle there. And if you want to squint at the photo a little bit, there's actually a second lodge that's directly behind that one and over to the left, which is a new one that was built just in the past 6 months or so, because this beaver family has obviously kicked some youngsters out, and they've gone away to build a second lodge within the same wetland complex. Beavers do remain active through the winter. If it's a Mexico dwelling beaver, they don't need to worry too much about ice formation, but a lot of the areas where beavers live do include seasonally ice covered areas. And one of, if not the main reason that they actually build that dam to create that water habitat is because they need the water to be deep enough that ice will form on top, but not reach all the way down to the base of the water, because the beavers will use the water in the wetland during the winter. They'll swim around underneath the ice, and they actually cache a lot of food within that underwater habitat. So before winter, they will bring bark-covered branches and greenery down into the water, and they will use that as a storage location for their food during the winter, so they can swim out of the lodge into the water, pick up their food, and swim back into the lodge without us ever having seen them, without predators ever having seen them. It might seem, if you were just out watching, that beavers aren't active during the winter, but they are quite active, just only underneath the ice and within the lodge. Because the lodge itself is above the water level, they have a little air vent on top, and they're able to get fresh air through the winter as well. Their preference for food includes, in the summer, they do like greenery, so they might eat sedges or grasses or other green material coming off of trees like leaves. In the off season, when there isn't fresh green material available, they will eat bark. And the picture there on the right comes from that earlier image where all those felled trees were. So it's only, where I am, it's only in the past 2 weeks or so that we've had green things starting to appear. But the beavers were, of course, awake and getting hungry before that. So they have been felling these trees and stripping them of their bark. This is a great spring food source for beavers, because in the spring, when before the trees begin their leaf out, but when temperatures are above freezing, we have sap that starts to flow through the bark of the trees. So it is not just that woody, barky material that they're getting, but it's actually quite high in sugars as well. So a great spring resource for those beavers to be eating. Now, that's a nice little introduction to some beaver biology. And I want to start getting into impacts that humans have had on beavers and vice versa. So the way that humans and beavers manage to coexist or don't manage to coexist in shared spaces. Humans have had impacts on beaver populations as far back as we have written records. We know that beavers, being a freshwater animal, were actually classified as fish by the Catholic Church. So they were a popular source of fish meats during Lent and on Fridays. If you were a practicing Catholic who did not consume meat, the beaver was considered a fish and could be used by you during those times. Very, very convenient. And we know that through hunting in Europe, both hunting for sustenance, like eating for food, as well as hunting for their fur, as they're in their role as a fur-bearing mammal. The first record of extirpation, when all the members of a species were removed from an area, was in England and Wales, where beavers no longer existed in those countries after the 12th century. So that's written down and it's documented that beavers used to exist in England and Wales and did not do so after the 12th century. And then as time went on, beavers were still a very highly exploited resource through both the UK as a whole, and they disappeared in the 1600s. And then through Europe and Eurasia in general, beavers continued to be very heavily hunted through the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, to the point where in the early 20th century, when good surveys were being done, the Eurasian beaver population was estimated at only 1,200 individuals. So think about the range of the beaver. We don't have good estimates of how many beavers might have been there before they were so heavily hunted, but we know that there were very likely millions. Now we'll get into kind of why Europeans use beavers so much for fur. The meat did not go to waste. Beaver meat was eaten even when beavers were trapped primarily for fur. And as the Eurasian beaver disappeared and became extirpated from more and more areas, the European fur industry was still bringing in hundreds and thousands of beavers every year because the market was still looking for that much beaver. Of course, at this point, beavers were primarily coming then from North America. Beavers have, they've been used in North America as long as people have existed in North America. They're a very important food source for a lot of indigenous populations, all the way from Alaska down into northern Mexico, like we said. It's a very nutritious meat, and it's very, very fatty compared to a lot of other land meats out there. There's certain oils produced by the castor glands that are also used as attractants for other animals that you might want to hunt, like marten and mink and lynx, so the animals that predate upon the beaver. So during those pre-European contact times, beaver were important to the indigenous peoples. Post-European contact, they were still important for both Europeans and indigenous peoples, but the way beavers were used began a fundamental change. All right, so instead of beavers just being taken for sustenance use, beavers were hunted by all, by both indigenous people and immigrants to North America just for entry into the fur trade. So this map that we're looking at here is a map of fur trading forts in North America. There were multiple companies that existed. You can see that the forts predominantly were built in the areas of high beaver population. So that red band there, everything within the gray area is considered beaver habitat, but the areas in the red are prime beaver habitat with many, many, many more beavers per square mile than anywhere else. That's where the beavers were, so that is where the fur trading forts were built. And the beavers were used mostly in the hat making industry. They weren't used for, mittens or gloves or jackets. The reason that beavers were so prized was for their use in making beaver felted hats. Right, this is why the Eurasian beaver was hunted nearly to extinction, and it's why there was such a demand that people would move across the world to go hunt beavers. It was like a gold rush, but in the form of a small fur-bearing animal. So these beaver hats were the height of fashion for over 300 years in Europe. There were different types of hats that were made, everything from the tricorn to the traditional top hat, and depending what stage of that 300-year period you were in, there were different hats that you would have wanted depending on your social status and what was in fashion at the time. But all of these kinds of hats were made from felted beaver fur. The pelts that came in from North America came in incredibly high numbers. To start with, the start of the beaver fur industry started off as a sideline business of fishing vessels who came to work the cod fishery in eastern Canada. But as Europeans expanded into the area that's now Canada and northern US, at the same time that the Eurasian beaver population was crashing, hunting of the North American beaver became the prime reason to come to North America. Through the 1700s, in any given year, at least 100,000 pelts were shipped every year, with some years being as high as 300,000 pelts. Each hat required somewhere between 1 to 5 pelts to make it, depending on the size of the beaver in question and the type of hat. There were different grades of pelts. The perfect pelt, if you wanted to get the best bang for your buck as a beaver trapper, was that you wanted to take a beaver in the winter when it was in its prime fur condition, before it got into that molting period in the summer, and then you would want to trap it in the winter and then wear it for at least 6 months, but more likely a year, because the wearing process actually helped start the breakdown process of the fur itself. So the guard hairs would start to come off, and that underlaying hair, that very soft hair, which is the part that was used for felting, would start to break down a little bit as well through wearing. And that initial breakdown helped make the process of felting easier and produce a better hat. So that was the way of getting best money for your trapping effort. The hat making industry was quite a thing. It employed many people, and there was tremendous amounts of money to be made in the beaver felt hat industry. Regardless of what kind of hat, what kind of pelt you got, it always started with removing any remaining guard hairs, so all that top layer of hairs, and then you would either shave or pull off that underlaying hair off the pelt. That was actually called beaver fluff once it came off, and this was the process that was done by women, as it wasn't considered to be a skilled type of labor. Women could definitely, pull out hair and make beaver fluff balls. Generally speaking, the women who were employed in this were usually not officially employed. They were used as wageless labor by husbands or fathers or brothers who worked as master hatters. After that, the beaver fluff came off, a process called carroting would begin. So carrots like the vegetable. And this is where an expression, mad as a hatter, comes into existence, because the process of carroting was a way of starting to remove and break down the keratin protein from the layer of hair and make it then again easier to felt. And the chemicals that went into the carroting process included a dilution of mercury salts in nitric acid. So it was a well-known thing that if you worked as a hatter and you were involved in this process of carroting, because mercury is such a potent neurotoxin, hatters tended to have neurological debilitations as a result of this. So once everything was cleaned and ready for felting, felting is really just adding moisture and adding agitation and adding heat, so everything tangles and shrinks together. You can felt wool, you can felt cotton, you can also felt beaver fur. Oh, sorry, bumped my microphone there. And in the end of it, you would have a finisher who made you a hat. And as I keep saying, this industry was really the backbone of the economy of North America for close to 300 years during this time. Before Canada was Canada and before the United States was the United States, we had an area called Rupert's Land, which was a territory given to the Hudson Bay Company by Charles I, so by the British monarchy, and they were given the company, the Hudson's Bay Company, and all their successors, all of the rights and duties and everything, all the land and everything that had to do with the land that flowed into Hudson's Bay belonged in exclusion to the Hudson Bay Company. And in fact, in 1868, as Canada was becoming Canada, Britain had to then purchase Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company and transfer that ownership to the new Dominion of Canada. So the Hudson's Bay Company actually still retains some prime land in Canada because they retain some of it as part of this deal. The fact that Canada really got its start as a fur trading nation, I mean, there are books and books and books and hundreds of years of history that we're condensing here. But what I really want you to get an appreciation for is how this great colonial push into Canada and into northern US would never have happened without the fashion industry being a major driver in Europe. So fashion trends likely led to me being where I live today, and for many of you, you living where you live today. If you had ancestors that came over here in the 16 or 1700s, they were likely at least peripherally employed in the fur trade. And the reason that Canada exists as it does today is because the British government decided that a company should have exclusive trading rights over a huge area of land. Um, it's it's only it's only something that we think about sometimes when we start to look at our stamps and our coinage and how big of a role the beaver has played, especially in the history of Canada. The Hudson's Bay Company, you can see their coat of arms there in the bottom right. In 1678, they put 4 beavers on the shield in the coat of arms because this is the founding animal of the Hudson's Bay Company. And the Hudson's Bay Company has been around for over 400 years and predates Canada by quite a bit, as mentioned. The Beaver on the top right is a Canadian history magazine that was actually put out by the Hudson's Bay Company, later by Canada's National History Society. It is still in publication, although they did change the name to Canada's History, just so it was less of a loaded title. And the first stamp produced in Canada, that 3-pence stamp up on the top left, was a beaver stamp. So unofficially, the beaver has been the emblem of Canada since before Canada existed. But it did get official status as a Canadian emblem only in 1975. The coin on the bottom left there, I just wanted to throw up so you got a sense about, again, how important the beaver was, not just in the fashion industry and in the economy and in the building of Canada, but even in its coinage. So this is a type of coin issued by the Hudson's Bay Company. Technically, it's a trading token because it wasn't issued by a government, so it wasn't legal tender, but it was recognized. Here you can see it's a 1/8 mark. This is a trading marker worth 1/8 of a made beaver pelt. So an adult male beaver in prime condition with the guard hairs removed. This coin is worth 1/8 of one of those. And then that trading coin could be turned in at any Hudson's Bay Trading Company post in exchange for trade goods such as whether it was firearms or ammunition or other metal goods like pots and pans or beads or cloth. This was the trade token. It was all done in the units of beavers. Now, beaver fur is not the only way that we use beavers. Most of the reason that the trade in beavers existed was for the fur, and it was for the European hat industry, and also the consumption of meat for sustenance reasons as well. But there is another product that we get from the beaver called castoreum. And this is a type of oil that comes from the castor sacs of beavers. So beavers produce castoreum in these sets of glands, and they use it along with urine to scent mark their territory. Both beaver sexes have them. They're located right by the anal glands, and the castor sacs have been and the castoreum that is produced within those castor sacs have been used for a variety of medical purposes during the years. Way back into ancient Greece, Pliny the Elder suggested it could treat vertigo, seizures, flatulence, sciatica, stomach diseases, and epilepsy too, as well as curing hiccups if you mixed it with vinegar. So it actually has been used as a medication through that period of fur trading as well. It was exported for use in traditional remedies. These days, it is used as a scent. So it's used in a small number of high-end perfumes, but you can also buy it if you've ever wanted to experience castoreum for yourself. There is a Swedish schnapps product that uses castoreum as a flavoring. Industry use of this product is very low. Globally, we're talking maybe 400 years of castoreum gets used. And if you compare that to vanilla, there's about 2.5 million pounds of vanilla that gets used every year. But for reference, The latest numbers I pulled up were from 2016. The sacks in this picture here go for anything between $3 to $5 per ounce. So it is a very reasonably priced addition to your schnapps or to your, also it could be to your headache remedy, because they do contain some amount of salicylic acid as well from all the willow and aspen trees that beavers eat. So it did have very real use as traditional remedies. We still use it today. Was not the main reason that beavers were hunted. So with all that in the history of our beavers, things were not looking great. The Eurasian beaver had been hunted nearly to extinction. The North American beaver, we never really got good estimates on how low the population get, but the low end estimate thinks that there was maybe 10,000 animals left in all of North America at the time when hunting ceased to the point that it was at that time. The main reason that things turned around is that beaver fur hats were no longer popular, silk was in, beaver was out, so there was no longer a need to be hunting the same numbers of beaver. And then, of course, there is the fact that beavers were nearly impossible to find. So even if you did want a beaver felt hat, the prices were very high because the number of beavers available were incredibly low. Like I said, down to a low estimate of around 10,000 individuals. We don't have great estimates either of what the original population of North America would have been. Ranges from an estimate of 60 million to 400 million beavers. Picture that down to 10,000. It's really an incredible decline. And in fact, as we were getting into the 19th century, the thinking at the time was that the beavers were gone. Like, if not all gone to the point that they would never come back. A zoologist by the name of Horace Martin in 1892 made note that the evidences of approaching extermination can be seen only too plainly in the miles of territory exhibiting the decayed stump, the broken dam, and the deserted lodge. So signs of beavers on the landscape, but no more beavers around. And in fact, hunting parties were sent out from a remote area in 1928 to look for beaver. They searched 25,000 square kilometers around an area just south of Hudson Bay. And in that 25,000 square kilometers, that team of trappers brought back only 4 beaver pelts. So things were pretty dire in the beaver industry, and things were much more dire if you were a beaver. So we were at that point in the early 1900s that the beavers have been trapped out of Europe. They have been trapped out of North America. And conservation efforts and an understanding that the land was something to be protected is really sentiments that started to begin in North America. And one of the prime voices that we actually still hear about in my neck of the woods today is a person who went by the name of Gray Owl. Gray Owl was one of the original conservationists of the Canadian prairies in the 1920s. And he presented himself as an Indigenous person who cared about the land and who wanted to bring knowledge of Canada to the world and all that the lands of Canada had to offer. Gray Owl was actually an English immigrant who took up the name Gray Owl, and his real name was Archie Bellany. But Archie Bellany, as Gray Owl, did have some really big impacts on the way we looked at various animals, but especially the beaver. He did a lot of writing. He starred in a black and white silent film called The Beaver People, which featured himself and his wife, who actually was Indigenous, with beavers in their natural setting. And you can actually still find this film from 1928 on the National Film Board website, because we keep those things in Canada. He had 2 pet beavers called Rawhide and Jelly Roll, and Rawhide and Jelly Roll went with him everywhere that he went. And these beavers interacted with visitors to the parks. They interacted with people who came to visit gray owl, and they were, like as mentioned, featured in his writings and also in this movie that had a huge part in kind of rehabilitating the image of the beaver, right? Think about this. For most people in the early 1900s, they would either never have seen a beaver or they might have seen one, but there was no real sense about what beavers did and what part they played in the landscape because they were so infrequently seen. So these conservation efforts really began in the 1920s and through the 1930s. Beavers were then a protected animal both in Canada as well as in the US, and they began to come back into their former ranges. You know, while beavers don't breed frequently, or they don't breed in great numbers, so they become sexually mature around the ages of 2 or 3. They only raise, 2 to 4 young per year. When they're not being actively hunted or trapped, and there's all this available habitat to them, beavers have been able over the last 100 years to expand and recolonize pretty much all of the areas that they were exterminated from over the last 400 years. So in North America, beavers have actually been found in the entirety of their original range. They have been able to bring themselves back with very few conservation efforts. Conservation of beaver traditionally has meant that you weren't able to hunt or trap them except under certain circumstances. So it didn't take a lot of effort on our parts as people to get beavers back to something approaching normal numbers. And this is true to a lesser extent in Eurasia as well. So in the 1900s, remember that we only had 1,200 beavers remaining, and those dark brown patches are where those original remaining populations were. And just by letting those populations expand while protecting them from hunting and trapping, they have been able to recolonize all the areas now that are colored light brown in that image. If you look over at the right-hand side there's a blue patch on there. That's a reintroduction, an introduction of North American beavers into Europe as well, because some people thought that was a good idea. But now that beavers are more common, we've ended up in the state where beavers have kind of an image problem, right? For a long time, beavers were emblematic of Canada, and they're on all our coins, they're on our stamps. Beavers were good. And now that beavers have expanded back into their original range, we consider beavers to be a problem or a pest. And beavers are actually, where I live, officially considered a nuisance species because they do things like building dams. And when a beaver builds a dam, depending where it builds a dam, it can flood farmland, it can flood roads, it can block culverts. And a lot of areas, both in the US and Canada, do have bounties on beavers, and you can go out and hunt or trap beavers and get some kind of financial compensation for that, because now we've turned things around and we're seeing all the ways that beavers change the landscape, and they're changing it in ways that humans tend not to like it. There are some non-lethal deterrents that get used. On the left-hand side here, you can see one called a beaver pond lever. It's a type of long tube that goes through a beaver dam, and it helps move water through and reduce the risk of flooding to surrounding areas, but it doesn't create a sound of running water within the pond itself or next to the dam. So the beavers aren't inclined to go try to fix it. There's also beaver exclusion fencing. You can see that on the right there. That's a type of fencing designed to stop beavers from moving into a culvert that moves water underneath a road and building a dam in the culvert, which has been a very expensive way of building dams. Part of the problem that we see here is that the budget that goes into using these non-lethal deterrents is often seen as more expensive than just removing the beavers. Though we know that when beaver habitat still exists, the beavers are going to come back into it. The thing is with beavers is that they are landscape architects. They're ecosystem architects. If you have a beaver or a population of beavers in an area, your landscape changes completely. Because they're building these deep water reservoirs that don't freeze solid in the winter, it increases the amount of open water in an area. It increases the amount of water held on the landscape. It reduces the amount of flooding because wetlands help slow water down as it moves over a landscape. And we know that it has a stabilizing influence on the groundwater. So in areas where you might traditionally have water that dries up in the summer and doesn't come back until the fall and winter, having beavers creating those dams and creating those water reservoirs can actually keep water on the landscape year round. So we often call them a keystone species because they have an impact on so many different things, for everything from water quality to creating habitat. Even standing dead wood, when they flood an area of forest, can create habitat for nesting birds and for things like woodpeckers. And it can also create very important habitat for fish species, such as the salmon and the steelhead. We know that in areas where beavers have been excluded and salmon exist, that streams become very eroded, they're very incised, meaning they cut very deeply into the landscape and into the ground. And what happens there is that there's no more floodplain. So the water is only going in this very small channel and it's moving very quickly. And it creates this situation where there may not even be standing water when fish spawning time rolls around. So studies have been looking at using both natural and artificial beaver dams in salmon streams to create habitat and retain good habitat. And evidence is so far 100% in favor for keeping beaver dams in streams where salmon and other spawning fish need to move. I think one of the coolest things that beavers do is create what we would call ecosystem resilience, the ability of a landscape to either return to its previous state after disturbance, or to be less likely to be disturbed by an external factor. This image here is what you can see basically all around this green spot is a large fire that's ripped through an area. This is a 2021 fire in Oregon, and everything burned except for the beaver dam complex here. And what's, I think, even more interesting about this is that there's many problems that happen post-fire, but a big problem that happens is that water quality is incredibly impacted. So any fish, any amphibians, anything that's using the water that comes through a fire area, it's ashy and it's generally very high in sediment, and it becomes an area where fish can no longer live, or the great big fish die-outs happen. By having those beaver dams there, they actually catch the water as it's going downstream and filter it out. And the downstream water was actually crystal clear and trout were present, as though the fire hadn't happened. And upstream of the dam, the water was incredibly unusable and high in ash and other sediments. So keeping beaver dams on the landscape doesn't just, it can reduce the risk of a fire spreading, but it can also help keep that landscape as close as possible to its original form, so that recovery can happen faster after a big disturbance like this. I think one of the biggest problems that we have is thinking of the lack of beavers as being normal, right? I grew up, probably most of you grew up, not seeing beavers on the landscape, and so we recognize a beaverless landscape is looking normal. But for North America, the norm and the way that all of our ecosystems work is by having beavers on the landscape and by creating those wetlands. This image here is just of a way that some organizations are working to attract beavers by creating what are called beaver dam analogs, so structures that work like beaver dams. It can still work to help help mitigate floods and reduce the amount of sediment, but it also attracts beavers to the area too. So it's a 2-for-1 kind of deal. So with this, before we move to questions, I just wanted to throw up one more slide just as a fun little thing. This is a picture of the world's largest beaver dam, at least the world's largest beaver dam that we know of. It's about 800 meters in length. So what would that be? About half a mile. And the entire perimeter of the dammed area is over a mile. So this is it's a big beaver dam. It's visible from space. There's multiple families of beavers that live here and maintain this, and this is located in northern Alberta in the Wood Buffalo National Park. Pretty cool. Thanks, beavers, for making everything better. And we'll move to questions.
Eleanor, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Lots of comments and questions already, but I want to remind everybody that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. So let's start with some fun ones. Do beavers really pat their tail after placing a stick when building their dam?
Beavers will sometimes pat their tails. It can be used for that. It is a very prehensile tail, so they can move it around quite readily. They have a lot of control over it. And it will get used mainly for patting in mud or sediment as opposed for helping placing the logs. We know that they have a great way of placing logs just using their teeth and using their forelegs, like their hands, to place, but the tail can help provide additional musculature, especially when patting in chunks of mud.
Got it. Do they use the entire tree for their dams?
No, so the entire tree is not used for their dams. The sticks that get used in dam construction are usually no more than about 6 feet long and, maybe 2 or 3 inches wide. They don't want to bring a whole tree down. Beavers aren't capable of carrying a whole tree. They're not that strong. They're strong, but not strong enough to move a 30-foot tree. So what they can do when they fell a tree, for example, the ones that were in my just on the edge of my yard there, they bring the tree down. They can eat the bark for nutrition, and then the bigger side branches will get clipped off and brought down to be used in either the dam construction or the construction of that open water lodge.
Are you aware of beavers ever getting hit by a tree that they just fell?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I've never heard of that. They do have a very formulaic way of bringing a tree down, so I suspect that it's something that they both teach their offspring, as well as I would guess it's something that's kind of innately built into their brain too. So they always fell downhill anytime they're on a slope, and the way that they cut is always quite prescribed as well. So they'll go all the way around the tree, and then they'll start cutting into the downhill portion, so it only falls that way. I've never heard of a beaver being hit, nor have I seen one. So I'm going to say either always no or almost always no.
And there's no onlookers while one's cutting down a tree. There's not danger of another beaver
if
getting.
a tree falls in the forest, does it ever hit a beaver? We'll never know.
All right. So in the lodges, is there a pooping chamber, or how do they deal with it with their waste?
Oh, great question. So, they have to do waste management just like any other animal does. Their kits are born over the winter, and so they'd have to deal with the waste from their newborn kits, and they also have to deal with their own waste. Now, if you've ever been camping, you probably know the rule, like don't drink water that a beaver has potentially pooped in, because they do defecate right into the water for the most part. With the youngsters, what they'll usually do within the lodge, when the kits are too young to leave, things will just get pushed over to the side, and they don't produce a lot of volume when they're young. It's not until they start eating a lot of that woody material that the amount of waste a beaver produces is as you might imagine, because they're eating a lot of roughage. There's a fair amount of waste produced as well, and that generally is not stored anywhere in the lodge itself.
Okay. One of our viewers noticed some lodge-looking structures in one of the local wetlands, but doesn't believe beavers live there. Are there other creatures that build lodges that look like beaver lodges? Or perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, so there's nothing else. I mean, I'm not sure where they live, but generally speaking, within kind of the beaver habitat area, there's nothing else that really builds a lodge the same way a beaver does. Sometimes animals will take over abandoned lodges. For example, fishers or minks will sometimes make use of them if a beaver isn't there. But usually what can happen with a lodge is that lodges are pretty robust features. So I'm going to take an example from my neck of the woods here, because I have a creek that runs right through my land, and beavers have come and gone over the years. And we have a very active population right now. 10 years ago, there were not nearly as many. The dams that they build last way longer than you would think a beaver dam would last. Eventually, they will lose their cohesiveness and they will get pushed out. But a well-constructed beaver dam, in my experience, might last 5 or 10 years while still retaining some water. A well-constructed lodge can easily last multiple years as well. And even if you don't have a current beaver population, likely there was one or a family unit there. Perhaps they were trapped, or perhaps they died for another reason, or perhaps the area flooded and they decided to leave. But generally speaking, seeing a lodge means that there was a beaver there at some point. It just maybe wasn't this year or even 5 years ago. It may have been earlier than that.
Fascinating. We've got so many great questions. Let me just try to sneak in a couple more.
If you're gonna ask me for a recipe for beaver tail, I don't have one. You'll have to make up your own, but I hear they're delicious. That's all I can say.
All right, this is a fun one. Do beavers build lodges by and dams by instinct, or do they learn from their parents?
Oh, it seems quite instinctive. So if if you have a beaver who is raised in captivity, for example, and you plunk them down as an adult next to a running stream, something in their brain goes, "Oh, running water, better stop it." And they have a very, very instinctive reaction and ability to build that retaining dam and to build a lodge. Beavers who, like a family unit who lives on a lake, may not ever build a dam, and their offspring may never have learned to build a dam. But if that offspring has to leave the lake because it's at capacity or because the lake has stopped being good habitat, they can go into a nearby stream and they will know how to build a dam, even never having seen one.
Fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. Thank you again. That was so fun. And the comments are overwhelmingly positive. Everybody really enjoyed learning about beavers, and I think they hopefully have a few more friends after this discussion. I want to turn it over to you for any closing comments.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for showing up and learning about the beaver. I'm pro beaver myself, even when that occasionally means that I've got a newly a new pond that wasn't there before, and maybe I've lost a little bit of land to a beaver dam. I think if we all can go out and appreciate beavers for what they do for us, knowing that sometimes when they flood out roads or they flood out agricultural lands, we're less tolerant of that, but keep in mind what they do for us and what they do for the ecosystem. I hope you learned something. I always learn something when I'm doing these too, and hope to see some of you next week for those webinars coming up then too.
Looking forward to it. Thank you everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a great day, everybody.